In this segment, we'll be applying the historical lens to teacher effectiveness and teacher evaluation. In that, I'm going to be providing an overview of some of the literature that surrounds teacher effectiveness, summarizing some of the indicators that have been used to measure teacher effectiveness, and also presenting some of the arguments, the rationale behind why we need to revitalize teacher evaluation, or why that argument has existed from about the mid-1990s forward. So to start with, and here I'm summarizing in very brief form a lot of different literature, which I would recommend that you dig into different aspects of it if you have interest. But the teacher effectiveness literature is really interesting, and I think it comes from a lot of different sources. But the first is this idea that teacher effectiveness actually does matter. And you'll see when we get into some of the more nuanced aspects of research summaries later in this segment, that there's disagreement about exactly which aspects of teachers really matter the most. So is it the number of years that they've been teaching? Is it their background? Is it how much content knowledge they have? But overall, the research suggests that for low-achieving students and for students of color, low-income students of color, that high-quality teaching really does matter in terms of their outcomes. And there's a set of literature that focuses on the kind of cumulative effect on these particular high-need students of having a high-quality teacher or a kind of low-quality teacher. And what we see is that for this particular body of students, the students that need it the most, it actually makes a huge difference whether they have a high-quality teacher or not. So that body of literature lays out the pressing need for effective teachers for this particular group of students. And I think the other aspect of that literature focuses on the fact that though those students need highly effective teachers the most, they're the least likely to get them. There's another body of literature that focuses on teacher expectations. Again, this is a voluminous body of research that I'm putting into a single bullet on your slide. But it essentially argues that teacher expectations drive student outputs. And so when a teacher sets a high bar for students, that they'll strive to meet that if it's done in a way that's where a teacher provides adequate supports for students to reach those goals or those benchmarks. And similarly, if a teacher has low expectations, students will similarly strive to hit that low bar rather than going above and beyond. And so the argument from here to teacher effectiveness is simple. It's basically saying if we have a group of teachers who have high expectations for students, and provide the right supports and instructional interventions, then students should be able to achieve at higher levels. Teacher turnover is certainly part of the discussion here. Teaching is a high turnover profession. About 50% of teachers leave the profession within the first 5 years across the country. In high needs areas, this is more like 80% in less than 3 years of teachers who leave the profession. And so when you think about effectiveness not just of individual teachers, but thinking about effectiveness at scale, then the teacher turnover question is a really important one relative to how we're going to have a workforce that takes students to the right places relative to achievement. Finally, there is a set of literature that really has started to think about the whole pipeline of improving teacher effectiveness. And what I mean by this is that if we're going to improve teaching at scale, then we need to consider the candidates that come into teacher education, how we educate them, whether or not candidates are kind of counseled out over time if they're not appropriate for the workforce, how we support teachers in induction when they land, how we evaluate them, how we tenure them, how we reward them when they're highly effective, et cetera. And a lot of this literature argues that if we don't attend to that whole pipeline, that we can't improve teacher effectiveness at scale. So I give you these just high-level bodies of literature to consider as the impetus for this intensive focus on teacher effectiveness in the United States and globally, because this is a global issue about the lever of the teacher being a really important one in improving schools. So here I'm summarizing just some of the indicators that have been used to measure whether or not a teacher is effective. And when I reference the body of literature that kind of tries to capture whether or not teachers are effective and what kind of aspects of the teacher matter, these are some of the avenues that scholars have explored. So is it, in fact, the level of education that matters? The difference between a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, does that make any difference in terms of how high quality a teacher is? In terms of teacher degrees and coursework, if you're teaching math, does it make a difference if you have a degree in math? Or does it make a difference in terms of your classroom management or your ability to foster a good school classroom culture, does it matter what coursework you've had relative to your effectiveness in those areas? So a lot of the research has used this, what a teacher has majored in or what kind of classes they took, as a proxy for actually measuring whether or not these factors matter relative to teachers' outputs with students. Years of experience is often put into the mix. So it's generally agreed in the literature that the first few years of teaching, the first 1 to 3 years, that most teachers have to take on this new practice. And, classroom management is a struggle in these early years. But what happens after we get through that kind of preliminary take? And do we see that teachers get more and more effective between years 3 and 10 and 15 and above? And so researchers have looked at this. Achievement. Thinking about a teacher in their preparation program, in their own college degree granting programs and their master's programs, what kind of grades did they receive? What kind of test scores did they get? And is there a relationship between that and how effective they are as a teacher? And finally, some of the literature focuses on the path to preparation. So there are different ways to enter the teaching force. There are alternate teaching certification routes. There's higher education teacher certification routes. There are kind of residency-based, really intensive multi-year approaches to this. And what researchers have tried to do is to see if any one of these paths is more effective than the other in terms of producing effective teachers. What I'm providing here, there's a lot of research directly on teacher effectiveness. I'm just giving you a couple of suggestions if you want to learn more about this. The Walter Doyle piece is a historical look at the way that the field was thinking about teacher effectiveness early in the kind of almost pre-modern school reform era. And the other two pieces, the Darling, Hammond, and Young's piece and the Go et al. Pieces, will give you a more contemporary view on the ways in which we're thinking about teacher effectiveness. And what these do is they provide a summary of a lot of other different studies and kind of arrange them thematically according to the findings. And so this will help you to understand the field in more detail, since I'm giving you just a very cursory summary. This Measures of Effective Teaching project, or the Gates MET study, is something that I'm going to spend more time summarizing and talking about. It's arguably the most comprehensive look at teacher evaluation in particular, about the indicators and tools that are used for measuring effective teaching. And so I just highlight it now as an important body of research, but I'll talk about it in more detail. So to close out this historical section, the question is, why revitalize teacher evaluation? And in some respects, this is connected to the literature I just summarized for you about the importance of teacher effectiveness. So if we don't know exactly what the mechanisms are or exactly what makes an effective teacher relative to preparation or background or experience, et cetera, we do know that especially for particular high-need students, that teacher effectiveness is important. So then the logic follows, how do we actually measure whether a teacher is effective? And teacher evaluation becomes a lever for that. I think there are some other reasons why teacher evaluation, the focus on that, has been kind of emergent on the school reform landscape. The first is just an agreement that the historical approaches don't work. And what I mean by don't work is they haven't actually differentiated among teachers. So prior to the more evidence-based teacher evaluation systems that we see in the 2000s, systems tended to produce results that said 95 or 98% of teachers in a school district were excellent or superior, or at the very top of the teacher evaluation scale. And everybody agreed, teachers, principals, teachers' unions, agreed that that just was not representative of the kind of distribution of teacher effectiveness. And so I think there was agreement across the board that if we want to develop the teaching force, that we need different ways to do that. The systems that were in place just weren't working. I think there also was kind of increased pressure around teacher effectiveness, certainly, that came from things like the No Child Left Behind Act and Race to the Top. And the idea, and you'll recall from the No Child Left Behind Act lectures, this idea of wanting to ensure that there was a highly qualified teacher in every classroom certainly put pressure on states and districts to push on this teacher effectiveness approach. Again, this is connected to this shift from inputs to outputs more generally around accountability systems in the country focused on schools. And I think it's also the case that measurement plays a role in this. The emergence of this idea of using value-added or student growth metrics, so taking student test scores of a teacher's of all the students in a teacher's classroom and trying to see what the kind of effect of their teaching was on student growth. I think the emergence of these methods got pushed into the field of education in a way that raised these broader questions about measuring teacher effectiveness. So that's the end of this historical segment. In the next segment, we're going to apply the summary lens to teacher effectiveness and teacher evaluation.